Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to All Things Policy. I am Avinash Shet, research analyst at high-tech geopolitics team at Takshashila Institution, and I am here with our guest Aakash Kumar, who is doing his doctoral research in science policy from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's an engineer with masters in international relations. So technology has become an essential part of everyday life, right? It's not only making individual life easy, but also changing the course of the future. It determines national power, economic powers, and the society as a whole. Hence, the development of technology plays an important role. It consists of a cycle where it starts from scientific development to R&D to a point where we build prototypes and the diffusion of the technology in the society itself. If we analyze India's current ecosystem of science and technology or R&D, the numbers do not paint a good picture. India only spends 0.65% of its GDP on R&D, while the Indian private industries only spend 35% within that. This is one of the reasons India see a lot of its talent move to West for better opportunities. And this can be seen in recent remarks by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Piyush Goyal, who emphasized Indian entrepreneurs to venture into deep tech startups, to build cutting-edge technology, technological products, and services. And in this episode, me and Aakash are going to discuss about Indian S&T ecosystem and the history of it, from where we have started and how come we and where we have reached now, right? So welcome, Aakash.
Thank you, Avinash. Thank you for having me on the show. It's good to discuss science and technology policy when science and technology is impacting society at large and influencing government's comprehensive national power. It is also playing a huge role in international politics, and countries are willing to invest a lot in science and technology policy for economic gains, for military advancements, and for overall societal benefits. So, going back to the remarks by Piyush Goyal, he was comparing India's startup ecosystem with China, where he talked what Indian startups are doing today, and he compared it with Chinese startup system, where Indian startups were more focused on food delivery apps, grocery apps, making fancy ice creams, and whereas on the other side, China was more focused on advancement in robotics, semiconductors, AI models. They were heavily investing in deep tech ecosystem. So to catch up with China and other technological power, India needs to up its game in science and technology policy as well as its startup ecosystem. So to give you a data, I would say that in India we are filing around 64,000 patents per year, whereas China files 16 lakh patents per year. So the gap is huge. And if we want to fill the gap in the startup ecosystem or science and technology ecosystem, we need to do a lot more works than we have been doing up till now.
We understand where we are in terms of science and technology when we even try to compare with the giants like US and even the very emerging country like China. So where did we miss that boat? I mean, let's go back to the whole history of how India started this journey. So let's go back to 1947 after independence. Thinking about science and technology, where you were anyway facing different challenges like poverty, illiteracy, infrastructure, health crisis. How do you think, what happened during that time that, science got its recognition? Did it not? I would like to know more.
So, as you know, India was under the colonial rule of British government. So, when British left us, they left us impoverished, as you rightly mentioned. And that resource deprivation that the country faced made our national leaders realize the importance of building a modern India, having a solid base in science and technology. So our modern leaders who were well educated, Western educated, they were of the belief that India needs to up its game in science and technology because we were facing resource crunch as well as we were facing talent crunch. Only a few elite people were made to study during the British rule, and most of them were trained in, say, law or medicine. We lacked scientific temperament, and that you will see following in the future policies that government of India made during those times.
Interesting. So, the first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was very fond of this whole science and technology, right? So, and also, I think it was also very crucial that he tried to sow in the concept of scientific temper. Uh, how much do we see, how important that was during that time?
So, to build a modern society, you needed a scientific temperament. And not only the 200 years of British colonial rule, the earlier rules before that also, we were in a kind of dark ages. Like Europe had a dark age, then they came out from it, from Renaissance, Reformation, and those scientific advancements followed. So, from 1100s, after the Delhi Sultanate, the foreign invaders came to India and established a Islamic rule. We were lacking that scientific temperament, which was earlier known to India in ancient India. So, India was a hub for science and technology in form of Aryabhatta's work, Susrut work, Panini's work, Charak's work, or works of Patanjali in transforming a human being himself. So India was a hub of science and technology in the ancient times, but somehow it went missing in the medieval and during the colonial rule. So Nehru was of the vision that to build a modern nation, we needed a scientific temperament in thought, so that we are not subjugated in the future as well. So that mindset was there to start off with.
But the path which was taken during those times, right? I think most of the decisions were taken in such a way that state led the whole science and technology ecosystem, where we don't see any sign of private players. Even though I do understand we had limited private players during those times, but why was this focus specifically on state leading all the S&T ecosystem?
So the answer can be given in two, three parts. The first part is the leader themselves. So Nehru was trained in UK and his teacher was Lusky and he came from a Fabian socialist background. So that socialist background of Nehru proved to be his own vision. So Nehru was a socialist from the outlook and before independence too. If you see his writings, if you see his works, so they were heavily influenced from the socialist countries like the Soviet Unions. In fact, Subhash Chandra Bose and Nehru, they both were influenced by the socialist background. So these socialist background came into their thought when they took over the leadership of this country.
Makes sense, right? One of the thing which I have, we do notice is we had very limited educational institution while when we were getting independence. And how do you think, what journey we took from 18 engineering colleges during that time all over India to, how that journey started to build in? I mean, I understand there are good lot of central labs, a lot of universities were built during those times. So and it's a huge project, right? I mean, you have literally nothing, and then you have to build all those things. So how do that looks like?
So if you look at that journey, na, Indian government came up with their own scientific policy resolution in 1958, and that focused on institution building. By institution building, I mean fostering those institutions who work on science and technology domain, like CSIR, Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, which was already existing during the British rule. It was founded around 1942, but government tried to make full use of those institutions. And post independence, government tried to develop their indigenous institution which can build India for the long term, like Department of Atomic Energy, INSCOPAR in 1962, which later became ISRO. So government's focus was on institution building and mostly educational institution, the IITs that you see today, starting from IIT Kharagpur, then IIT Bombay, Delhi, Madras, and so on. So these IITs were built, and now we are standing at 23 IITs, 31 to 32 NITs, 26 triple ITs, 7 IISERs, and 26 AIMS. That is a huge feat from where we have started.
Yeah, so that whole era after 1958 scientific policy resolution has built up the foundation, I would say, right, for building this SNT ecosystem. Let's go ahead to 1980s, 1970s, where there was a lot of changes and there was a lot of push for India to develop its own technologies. I think it kinds of came from a lot of Western sanctions during those times, and I think specifically the nuclear test, which happened in 1974, I guess. Yeah, and there was a lot of focus on import substitution, developing technology in India. And that was, I think, very specifically, it was the doctrine was put it in technology policy statement of 1983. So, a very interesting change of events. And I would like to ask, now that, during that time when the whole country, when the government want the condition was such a way that, India wanted to build its own technology so that next they don't have to worry about sanction, or, sanction doesn't affect that much because we will be having, or India will be having its own, technology. And so was the technology self-reliance approach successful, which was started during 1983? What's your take on that?
Yeah, as you rightly put in, India put up their technology policy statement in 1983. And if you go into the preamble of that document, it says that political freedom must lead to economic independence and the alleviation of the burden of poverty. So the political
Okay.
independence was the key term. And from there on, self reliance came into the picture. As you rightly put in, India was faced with international challenges from Pakistan, challenges from China, and challenges from the US China Pakistan axis. You need to put in that into context. So US was doing rapprochement with China post 1972's Nixon visit, and US was also working with Pakistan. So India had little options at those times. So India could not take technology from the US, and India was mostly reliant on Soviet style planning. So in the 1983 technology policy document, there was a heavy emphasis on self-reliance, and you see Indian government putting up those technological or scientific institutions according to that. So in 1984 you will see that India develops its own semiconductor manufacturing complex, Semiconductor Complex Limited, SCL, in Mohali. So that was a pioneer in semiconductor industry in India. And it was doing fairly well in semiconductor. At that time, TSMC has not come up, and India was ahead of its times. So the main thrust of the government was on self-reliance, even self-reliance in a technology called semiconductor, which we are still striving to have. So the semiconductor
Interest.
complex laboratory was set up in Mohali, Punjab, and institutions like those which made India self-reliant were given priority in the Indira Gandhi's, especially in the Indira Gandhi's regime. So you see many institutions pop up, and the SCL facility was doing very well. It was building PCM MUX, pulse code modulator multiplexers, which was important for India's telecom industry, and it was getting orders from it. So it was doing fairly well until the fire incident come up in 1989. So that fire incident ruined that facility, and we could not recover from that. So a lot of emphasis was put on self-reliance in technology and scientific endeavors at that time.
It's interesting. So, did the overemphasis on the import substitution, did that limit innovation and global competitiveness?
So that's a complex question. So focus on self-reliance has its own negative impact, like import substitution thing, but it can also be beneficial to foster domestic innovation. So it's like a double-edged sword. So if you see during that time, post 1983, there was a domestic change in the government, and India went near bankruptcy. So we have to go for 1991 liberalization, privatization, and globalization reforms. That was very critical for India's
Okay.
future. So in 1991, PV Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh, P. Chitambram come up with this idea that India needs to open up its market. But those market reforms allowed for cheap imports to come into India, especially in terms of electronics goods, which were used to manufacture electronic components. But that also paved important for India's growth in IT sector. So while it did benefit in India's IT sector, it dried up our electronic component manufacturing. And manufacturing is a big issue in India's growth story because we are hovering around 18-19%, and now we have downgraded ourselves to 17-16% of our GDP, which is contributed by manufacturing. So that's a double-edged sword according to me.
So, in this technology policy statement, one of the very interesting thing which was mentioned was the integration, or the technology transfer between the scientific labs and the industries, right? Which which is very crucial for a technology, to building a technology itself. But that's a problem we have been seeing even now. So what was the implication of this policy during those times?
So actually, that lacuna still remains in research ecosystem of India. That from basic to applied part, there's a big gap, and that is called valley of death. So if you are doing research into some fundamental stuff, and you are not coming up with a prototype, or you are not coming with a final product, that kills the whole advancement of your research. So the basic research is important, so is the applied part. So if you look at work by David Stokes, who did his work on basic research and innovation, so he gave that past year's quadrant where he talked about where what is the linkages between basic and applied research. So Niels Bohr, he talks about Niels Bohr, who was more focused on understanding atomic structure. So his work was on the basic fundamental part of the atomic model. It was not related to some applied stuff. Whereas he takes the example of Thomas Edison, whose main goal was to build a bulb and not do any fundamental research on the scientific part. So there are these two contrasting characters, Niels Bohr and Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison is solely focused on the practical stuff, and Niels Bohr is focused on primary fundamental research. And there is Louis Pasteur. who is focused on both. So he's doing that fundamental research on bacteria and viruses, and he comes up with a vaccine. So Pasteur is the classic example how to build that gap between basic to applied research. And Niels Bohr and Thomas Edison falls on the extreme. And if you are into tinkering, you do some basic, some applied, not here, not there. So this is the quadrant that David Stokes talks about in his book Pasteur's Quadrant. And coming back to your question on basic to applied, so that is the problem which we still face. And bureaucracy, lack of funding, lack of private collaboration with the academia hampered the focus on building industry academia collaboration even those time, and India grapples with it even today also.
So, even though it was a good idea, but something it has been not yet figured out how we can make it happen, right? That's nice. So now you did mention about at 1983, during those times, we were so much focusing on the self-reliance, and things changed very drastically after 1991 reforms, right? Where India opened up its market to globalization, and so a new policy came during those times. In 2003, we had the science and technology policy, which very much focused on globalization and competitiveness. I think the whole frame of how you look at science and technology, how we wanted to build our science and technology ecosystem, the whole formula, the whole approach has changed to now globalization, building best, what can be exported, and so and opening Indian market for the products from the other nations, right? So, did globalization improve India's science and tech ecosystem during those time? I mean, in after 1991, what's your thought on
The
this?
short answer to that would be it's complicated. So many economists, many science and technology policy experts have tried to understand the impact of globalization on India's R&D sector. So while in several sectors like IT, pharmaceuticals, it benefited India. Globalization did benefit India. But in sectors where we did some sort of manufacturing, either it was killed or we were too dependent on the cheap imports that were coming in, especially post China's ascendance into WTO. So China joined WTO in 2001, and that was a game changer in global economic relations. So post 2001, every electronic manufacturer or every component manufacturer were, were dependent on Chinese imports. So Chinese imports made us handicapped. And now we are seeing that self-reliance pillar coming into the fore again in India, where we are doing self-reliance, Atmanirbharta in manufacturing, Atmanirbharta in defense, and as well as other important critical sectors. So we were not benefited by globalization. I would not say that. We were greatly benefited by globalization. We have a thriving startup ecosystem. We have a thriving Silicon Valley in terms of Bangalore. We have thriving IT system. So globalization benefited. It lifted millions out of poverty, but it had some unintended consequences for our manufacturing, which still hovers around 17%, and it has reduced to 16% of our GDP. And Make in India and other manufacturing initiatives are an indication that India needs to ramp up its game in manufacturing sector.
Yeah, it, and I think you mentioned about IT. So one of the thing which was specifically mentioned in 2003 S&T policy was encouraging public-private partnership, right? And in R&D, like I know we do have PPP model for infrastructure, but for R&D and innovation was something envisioned or thought of it uh, even during 2003 as well. But Do we see any successful model for it in science? Did it take any root during those times?
So, if you look at the 2003 Science Technology Policy document, it talks about increasing R&D, and
Hmm.
it talk about increasing R&D spending to 2% of our GDP. It was the first time when it was talked about. And it set a milestone for India that we need to set our GDP in, and we need to set in our resources for R&D. And when we look at the sectors that got benefited, like we talked about IT, pharmaceuticals, we talk about domestic manufacturing, some sort of domestic manufacturing kicking in terms of building electronic components and all that. But the major good that it did was in services sector. So you look at the services sector where McDonald's, Coca-Cola, all those brands came into India. So not impacting R&D directly, it impacted our economy to a great degree.
So what happened to our indigenous development? India was developing various technologies which was inspired from 1983, right? I mean, a lot of indigenous technologies for defense and otherwise. Uh, did anything change? I mean, did because of this the pace got slow? So what happened to that whole direction?
So you look at the period. So science and technology policy outcome is always associated with international structure. So in those times, there was a sole superpower in the game. That was US. And we were doing defense cooperation. We started doing defense cooperation starting from 2005 onwards with the US. And we had that civil nuclear arrangement with the US, which was passed by our parliament in 2008. But due to the globalization era, and you can always call it an era of hyper globalization, even China, even Russia came into the fold of globalization. So, due to this globalization phenomena, we exported our services in terms of IT. We built our IT sector, but none of the indigenous manufacturing took off in that period post 2003. And that was also aligning with the international environment of hyper globalization. That world has become a global village.
Yeah, yeah. So moving on to the next era itself and next decade itself, right, where um, there was a concept for innovation for all, and which was very much reflected in the science, technology, and innovation policy, which came in 2013. I think that was the key. Innovation was the keyword. Inclusive innovation was, something which been talked about, saying that technology is not just for elite, but it should also reach to all section of Indian population, including rural and so. And that's where the whole boost for startup culture, that's what that has been brewing those times, has come into picture. So with this 2013 science, technology, and innovation policy, uh, did this policy give space for frugal innovation, innovation at grassroots level?
If you go back to 2013, the document stated innovation for the first time. And you need to trace that transformation from Scientific Policy Resolution 1958, Technology Policy Statement 1983, Science and Technology Policy 2003. And for the first time, innovation word was put in the policy document itself. So did it help frugal innovation? Yes, it did. But in the next year itself, the government changed at the center. So, all the people centric approach that it talked about was to be taken up by the next set of people who were at the helm of affairs starting from 2014. But one interesting thing that STIP 2013 did was it set up the priority that India should be in top 5 of science and technology in the world. So it set an ambitious target, and it focused more on people's inclusion into the process of science and technology creation, science and technology production, and innovation itself. So it was all about inclusivity. And one more thing that I wanted to add was, firstly, we talked about linking science and technology policy with the international structure. Second, we should also see it as an outcome of the government which is in power. So in 2013, the UPA government was in power. So all the pro people, all the welfare schemes that the UPA 1 or UPA 2 launched, it wanted to have an inclusive growth, which was also an agenda for their 5 year plans. So this time they wanted inclusivity to be a keyword for science and technology policy.
Interesting. So do this inclusivity did help the other stakeholders who are part of SNT, like the smaller stakeholders like SMEs, small and medium enterprises, startups. In what ways it has tried to get them up?
So for the first time in India, you will see some sort of startup culture happening. So it was like
Yeah.
a baby step for the startup ecosystem to grow in India. And at the same time, the government came up with their national policy on electronics 2013, which still is a bedrock for electronic innovation in India. So the government came up with a lot of policy, but the policy paralysis that happened in Indian politics from 2011 to 2013 until the government was changed in 2014, that hampered its execution. So, like all the policies that we have, India is a soft state in executing good policies. So, it did set the ground running, but it didn't take it to the next step that was required for the science and technology growth in India.
Do you think there was a shift from the earlier way of self-reliance, globalization to more of a co-development?
Yeah. So, co development, co creation, are terminologies used in science and technology studies. But you see that to execute it properly, you always need to go back to your institutions, your research institutions, your universities, your academia, and your industry academia collaboration must come into the fore to execute these policies, to get the policies running. But in India, we lack that industry academia collaboration that we have been talking about since 1983 technology policy statement. And that problem still remains in India.
Yeah. So there are so many problems, which India has to deal with, including co-development among the stakeholders in Indian ecosystem. There are, even the whole, uh, what do I say, the 2% mark, which was established in one of the policies, right, in 2013 policy. And so, how do you think this new, 2020 draft of, science, technology, and innovation policy is going to, even though it's a draft policy, right? And do you think this policy, which is, you know, will survive, will give India the direction to not only put in the ambitious goal we want to achieve, but the strategy and how we're going to implement these to get to that goal. So, what do you think of the whole draft, science, technology, innovation policy itself?
So the draft STIP 2020, again, you need to go back into the context or the international structure that in which it has been brought in. So there was a trade war going on between US and China, all the trade war, tech war, chip war, and the COVID-19 pandemic. All these culminated into a policy document, and you need to look at this document in that context. Even the Galwan tensions in June 2020. So we were over reliant on Chinese imports, like we have talked about from 2001 to 2020. We were hugely reliant on Chinese imports. But after the Galwan incident, the government realized it is not sustainable in the long run. We cannot be so dependent on a particular country for our imports from which we have been having tensions since very long. So the government brought in this draft STIP 2020, and a huge focus was given on self-reliance and Atmanirbharta. So you see after 37 years that self-reliance term came into the picture again. But Prime Minister clarified in his speeches that it is not re-import substitution. It is not reintroduction of import substitution. He clarified India will make for the world. India will go global from local. So the government was aware that import substitution had its limitation. That's why we shifted away from it, but we were willing to take that risk in building indigenous technologies that has been heavily mentioned in STIP. And to build that indigenous capability, we are doing a slew of measures from Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, Still Viksit Bharat, PLI, DLI. All those schemes are part of that broad picture that we are willing to take in the long run in science and technology ecosystem. Coming back to the GERD 2% spendings, we are very short of it. Israel spends around 6% of its GDP, China 3%. So our competitors are investing much more than us, but at one point it's not about only about the quantity of some or the quantity of money that we put in. It is also about the usage. So we can build our indigenous technology in the limited resources that we have, and STIP 2020 is a very comprehensive document in that sense, because it takes the international structure into the consideration. It takes the brain drain, brain gain, and brain circulation. It has a dedicated section on diaspora as well, to engage Indian diaspora in India's science and technology growth. So it is a very well documented paper in that sense.
So even 5 years after that policy, I think brain circulation or brain gain would be really important based on the geopolitical tension around what is happening in US, right? So I think, yeah. So but I have one question on private sectors, right? I mean, I think it's one of the question pondered by literally everyone is that these Indian private sector is not really investing on the R&D, right? We don't see them, the amount of money which has been put by huge corporations all in the West, China. And so my first question would be, do you think we even need to worry about it? Uh, Second, if we have to, then what can be the way forward? I mean, what is that, is it going to be risky for India if the private industry doesn't get into this mode of building this high tech, these cutting edge technologies? I think that's where we started with, right? I mean, how China is building, technologies, which is, investing hugely on emerging technologies, but we are nowhere there. When I say we, Indian companies, Indian private industries are nowhere there. So, what is your view onto it?
So it is a classic dilemma that any country in the world faces. But India is facing it big time, that private investors are not coming up in the R&D sectors. So to quote Piyush Goyal himself, he said that private investors should show that bada dil, big heart. In that speech, from where we started our conversation, in that speech only he talks about that investors, because the startup ecosystem in India also is hugely dependent on the foreign capital. And Indian industrialists, Indian businessmen are not investing into Indian startups. That is a huge concern for the government. And that's why Piyush Goyal talks about the Bada Dil. He is also the Minister for Commerce, which represents India into the global talks on technology, on IPs, on everything. Every trade deals is somehow generated by his department only. So, Minister of Commerce Piyush Goyal talks about that bada dil, which every country talks about. Even US talks about it. But in US, the private industrialists are aware that they are going to get benefited from the R&D investments. And in India, there is a focus on getting short-term profit. So in the same speech, Piyush Goyal talks about private industries should not focus on gaining short-term profits. They should focus on long-term. And to take a cue from Vijay Gokhale's book, we need to play that long game in R&D sectors. So the private investment is a worry. We need to work on that. And in ANRF also, Anusandhan National Research Foundation, which was launched in 2023, the government talks about gaining that public private partnership into R&D. So the 36,000 crores that is supposed to be brought in by the private players, the government is working on. Out of 50,000 crore, 36,000 crores needs to be gained from the private players. So how government will do it? If it would nudge it, if it would call up a meeting with private sectors, I don't know how it will work, but it must work because your competitor China is playing on whole another level. In March 2025, they have announced that they will be investing 1 trillion yuan on emerging technology. 1 trillion yuan is equal to 138 billion US dollars. That is a huge sum of money. They will be investing in long term high tech industry like quantum technologies, AI, semiconductors, and even robotics. So they are going to build robots on a huge scale, complemented with the AI models that they are building. So AI in itself will not help you until you complement it with robotics or some other form of technology. So China is aware of that fact that to get AI into its full potential, they need to develop that robotics. They need to go for quantum computing. They need to go for advancements. They need to go for advancements in microelectronics or semiconductor industry. So China is investing 138 billion US dollars, and you are cramping for 50,000 crore rupees, and out of which 36,000 crores needs to be taken in from private sector. So that is a huge sign of concern as well as an opportunity for private players to fill in that gap that is existing.
So Akash, now that we have talked about the whole S&T ecosystem, the policies from independence till now, till the draft of science, technology, and innovation policies of 2020, where do you think India is moving? Now that we have a lot of latest development happening in terms of, as you mentioned, the ANRF coming in, one nation, one subscription, and lot others. So, what do you think the trajectory look like for India? Where are we heading?
So India has a very bright future in science and technology, even innovation ecosystem, because you see the sheer number of human talent that is coming up in India. So if you look at the data in the STEM graduate field, China has 35 lakh STEM graduates annually. India has 25, 26 lakhs. So we are the second highest STEM producing country in the world. And apart from STEM, we are also producing STEAM graduates, like people working in humanities and arts as well. So if you look at India's future in science and technology, it's very bright. And India's patents have grown up annually, and India is catching up with the rest of the world because earlier patent regime was not so user friendly, people's friendly. So students are filing more patents, researchers are filing more patents. We are second in STEM graduates. We have brilliant courses in engineering and AI and quantum. So the future looks bright, but that stakeholder approach needs to be brought in into actuality. We are writing it on paper that industry academia collaboration must be there. We came up with some sort of internship scheme, but that is not working to India's advantage. India should have a robust policy regarding SOPs, how industry can set up their labs, set up their facilities in the universities. Like, if you look at the top premier institutions, there are some sort of collaboration, but other than that, there is hardly any collaboration. So the government recognize this, and government have come up with their ANRF pair scheme, so partnership for accelerated innovation and research. So in this pair scheme, they are coming up with their hub and spoke model. So they are identifying institutions across regions. Like in Delhi, they have identified JNU. Like in South, they have identified IISc. So they are coming up with these hub institutions which are working on research, and they can handhold the spoke institutions like some central universities, some state universities, and to build that research clusters around them. So in India now, in India we have a thriving startup ecosystem as well. We have around 1.59 lakh startups in India recognized by DPIIT, and now we have deep tech startup ecosystem also gaining traction in India. We have around 3500 odd deep tech startup. So the future looks good, provided that we work on the execution part of our policy that was lacking in the earlier science and technology policy documents. That was lacking in earlier science and technology
Mhm.
policy vision of India.
So interesting. And that's there's so many things we have discussed in this in terms of the whole science and technology ecosystem, R&D ecosystem, and so I'm really grateful that you connected with us, and giving us all this information of all the SNT, science and technology, and innovation policies, and not for me, even for our audiences. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Avinash. Thank you for having me, and great to connect with you and the audience as well.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.